I was reading the play and it just hit me, like, is X a reliable narrator? Is this whole thing with Bob a consensual affair? And it just my version developed a lot out of digging into that silent and absent character of Bob and trying to figure out who he was. You know, it's not just about which one of these two women is the stronger, but there's also a third party at play here, and I didn't want to let that go unnoticed. The way I read the play, they're both very different. You have one who is married with children, and you have another who, you know, was going to get married but doesn't have kids, very much gave me the impression that she was like a career first kind of woman, where the other is managing to balance her family with a career in the theater. So we just sort of started to carve away at those two different types of women, neither necessarily being stronger than the other, just different, like apples and oranges.
When Strindberg wrote The Stronger, it was at a moment in his life when there was some personal uncertainty, and part of that uncertainty was that his wife, who was an actor and quite a well-regarded one, was having an affair with her very good friend Marie, who was also an actor, whom you can tell from Strindberg's letters that he hated. And he characterizes her, and it may be fairly, as an alcoholic and whatever, but she was certainly a lesbian, and that was known beyond Strindberg in his letters. That's sort of in the histories. And so Strindberg wrote this play for his wife to play the speaking character, a character who circles around things but basically says home and husband and children are what matter. That's what you should have, non-speaking character. And their conversation really centers on this male, this person to whom the speaking character is married, and he has such a kind of invasive presence. When you just read it on the page, he is like standing right there in the middle of the room, taking up space. And what's interesting is in his stage directions, he specifies that this is a women's cafe, which is not something we have now, but it's denoting a female-only space. And yet there he is, worrying about what women are saying behind his back, because that is, there's a fear, right? And that when women go off to the bathroom together, that maybe they're talking about you. And that's deeply threatening. So he wrote a play about what they say about him when he's not there. I don't think that that's the play we have to do. I don't think that that's necessarily even the play that he left for us to do, particularly once you pull out all his little stage directions, because I don't believe in stage directions, and then you look at the text, and then what you have left is the actual relationship between the two women. And the relationship between the two women, we know from history, was an intimate one. And when you kind of ask Strindberg to leave the story, you're left instead with the exploration of this on-stage relationship that we get this momentary glimpse into, and I think that's really powerful.
When we first got started, I was like, oh man, we're doing like two different shows, but like they're the same and they're not, and I thought it was gonna be like hard. And it's not easy, I wouldn't say, but it's definitely, they're so different. Even though it's like the same script, more or less, with a couple changes here and there, like the stories that we're telling are completely different, and so the characters are worlds apart from one another, so it's kind of just like being in two very different shows, even though the script is effectively the same. I think the biggest challenge that like I continue to have as we're like still running and like figuring things out is that both of my characters in each version, when I speak and when I don't speak, have really like big emotional arcs over the course of like the 20 minutes that we're doing our little show. And so to try and have like this fully fleshed out emotional arc in the span of 20 minutes where like you start at this one high and then you end up at this really low, or like you start kind of like average and then you go to a peak and then you crash, is really difficult to do in such a short amount of time. But it's also really fun to try and make that work, and to especially like figure out where can I take my time to make sure that I am doing this character justice.
And I realized I think it would honestly be more difficult if it was the same director doing both versions. The concept was the same. Having two directors and two concepts allows me to like compartmentalize it a little bit more. Yeah, so it almost doesn't really feel like doubling. It just feels like two completely separate shows for me. The concepts for these two versions are so specific and have almost nothing to do with the lines that are actually being said, right? There is so little actual written language that supports what's happening underneath. So it was like we were cutting out our own puzzle pieces from cardboard with a very vague picture of what the puzzle was supposed to look like in the end, because the subtext was the framing of the whole thing, right? These two women have had some kind of relationship in one version, and in the other version, there's a big trauma that has happened that's just kind of bubbling underneath the whole interaction, and is this going to be acknowledged or isn't it? So making the language work for me and for the vision of the director was a struggle that turned into a blessing.
One of the kind of gifts and challenges of being a classic theater and having this historical bank of plays to do, many of which are white male canon, is that you are on the one hand sort of constrained, but that the exciting thing is this, that these stories were written by white men and they have centered a certain kind of experience. But people of color, queer people, women have been around in all the times that these plays have been written. They are there and they are in the plays. Even if that's not what the author meant, even if that wasn't what the author was thinking. So they exist. And part of, I think, the kind of modern challenge for the classic theater is to reveal the stories that are in these works and put the missing people back into the history we tell.